Let's bring in our political editor, Andrew Clennell, on that issue and the other issues of the day. Andrew, first of all, let's look at the stimulus, because this is the main game this week. The Expenditure Review Committee has been meeting today in Sydney to finalise that. The Cabinet basically convening as we speak this afternoon to give their approval before it goes ahead.
That's right, Kieran. So a very lengthy meeting of Expenditure Review Committee in Sydney this morning, and the finishing touches are being put to what appears to be the first of the government's coronavirus economic stimulus packages. Indications are our reports yesterday that cash payments will be provided are correct, only they will be limited to certain groups such as perhaps pensioners, recipients of Newstart and small businesses. It was put to me this morning that everything was on the table in terms of the meeting of the ERC this morning, except the notion of cheques to all Australians, as occurred during the GFC with Kevin Rudd. But decisions were still to be made this morning on exactly how large any cash payments to certain groups would be. We know, and we've reported, there'll be some sort of wage subsidies for small business, likely a freezing of export costs, money for the tourism industry, as well as the cash payments. Excluding paying all Australians is part of Scott Morrison continuing to insist his stimulus package of close to $10 billion is targeted and scalable, while Kevin Rudd's during the GFC, he's labelled irresponsible in terms of that business of giving every single Australian, no matter how rich or poor, a cheque. Let's hear Matthias Cormann, the Finance Minister, double down on that theme this morning in terms of his criticism of the second phase of Rudd's stimulus, school halls and pink bats. Have a listen. Have we got Matthias Cormann from the...
We will not be pursuing a reckless Rudd-Gillard-style cash splash with money spent on pink bats, putting pink bats into roofs, and money spent taking pink bats out of roofs, overpriced school halls, and indeed cheques to dead people. We most definitely will not be doing that.
Matthias Cormann there, Andrew, trying to put a bit of distance between their approach and that of the then Labor government. I want to play for our viewers as well some of the comments that Jim Chalmers has been focusing on. We'll get those and then I'll get your reaction to it. This was the Prime Minister on comparisons between this crisis with the GFC.
COVID-19 is a global health crisis, but it also has very real and very significant economic impacts, potentially greater than the global financial crisis, especially for Australia. The epicentre of this crisis, as opposed to that one, is much closer to home. The GFC impacts were centred on the North Atlantic, and back then China was in a position to cushion the blow for Australia. We also need to learn from the mistakes made from the global financial crisis, especially when it comes to ensuring that we have a clear fiscal exit strategy. The range of possible economic outcomes will depend on the spread, severity and duration of this health crisis and its interaction with the demand side and the supply side effects. Now, that means to fix our problem, our health response must be the primary response. I don't find speculation on those things terribly helpful. What I find helpful is what we do and what we announce, and explaining why we're doing it and how we're doing it, and ensuring that we're delivering on the things we say we're going to do. That's what changes circumstances, that's what delivers the desired effect, and that's what the government and I am very focused on. What we do. What you do matters.
Is it a case that everyone's going to have to dip into their savings, even households, on top of what the government's going to do? Is it an admission the government can't do everything?
Well, the economy just isn't made up of the government. It's made up of businesses, it's made up of households, it's made up of everybody.
The Prime Minister there on the prospect of a recession at the end. The first part was comparing this crisis to the GFC. What do you make of where the politics are at around the government's response to this right now, Andrew, and in terms of the PM referring to the GFC, which was 12 years ago now?
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, a week or two ago he's saying we don't need a response similar to GFC because there was a run on the banks. It won't be as bad, almost seems to be the implication of that. Now he's saying it could be worse. And my understanding is that's because of recent advice from economists and Treasury saying, depending how long this health crisis goes, it could indeed have a worse effect on Australia. And obviously, as he's pointing out, China's more of an influence on this crisis than it was on the GFC. That was more a European and American problem, and China was a little bit cushioned there. So really concerning things the PM has to say, particularly when the markets are falling. They bounce back regardless of his comments, but it's kind of an interesting change in rhetoric. And it's something I guess the opposition seized on, because they were saying, you know, where are they at, the government? They keep changing their rhetoric on the crisis.
And in terms of the response to this one, is it time for him now to leave the Kevin Rudd comparisons to one side? Because I'm not sure that that has a huge amount of traction outside of what he calls the bubble.
I totally agree. Look, Kieran, I mean, basically people just want the health concerns addressed and the economic concerns addressed. The ordinary person around the kitchen table isn't sitting around thinking, is this like the Rudd package? There are no pink bats or school halls. Fair enough. You can say that once. You don't have to say it at the top of an interview. You don't have to say it consistently and over again. You don't have to almost prove it to yourself that there's no Kevin Rudd stimulus involved. Ordinary people aren't thinking about the Kevin Rudd stimulus. They're just thinking about how to go about their normal lives at the moment.
And hoping that we avoid a recession. Let's look at Andrew Constance now, the New South Wales Minister, very much respected for his role during the summit from hell and all the fires in his particular seat. But it sounds like he won't be in state parliament for long. No,
he said on Alan Jones this morning that he's retiring once he has seen through the bushfire recovery on 2GB. A bit different to when we interviewed him last week, and he didn't want to make any big decisions at the moment, he said. I understand that Mr Constance just wants a break, some time to reflect. He wants to get his community through the recovery and then get out of state politics, but he won't be ruling out a federal tilt, and this is where it gets interesting, Kieran. The obvious place for him to be talked into that is an attempt to run for the New South Wales South Coast seat of Gilmore, the only seat Labor won off the Liberals at the last election. Now, Constance, given his profile in the local community after the fires, you'd think he'd have a really good chance of winning that seat back off Labor. Of course, a state by-election with Mr Constance retiring in a year or two would cause headaches for Gladys Berejiklian, the New South Wales Premier, who has a two-seat margin like Scott Morrison, but it could help Scott Morrison at the next election if he were to go federal. In terms of current and former New South Wales politicians going federal, there was speculation when Mike Baird left the National Australia Bank last week that he could run for the federal seat of Warringah. I'd say there's much more chance Andrew Constance would run for Gilmore than Mike Baird would run for Warringah in 2022. It's been known for some time, Kieran, that Andrew Constance either wants to be Premier or go federal. He hasn't got the party room support to be Premier, and Gladys Berejiklian keeps saying she's running in 2023. Let's hear what Andrew Constance said about the fact he's retiring. He says he's retiring this morning.
I've said before, I'm just going to do the recovery and then I'm going to resign because, this changes you.
Are you serious?
Yeah, it changes you, mate. Like, it really just makes you realise politicians can expend too much energy on the internal machinations and forget why they're elected.
Andrew Constance there talking to Alan Jones this morning. Let's finish up. I want to play for our viewers a recap if they missed it. A bit of an exchange between Annalise Nielsen and the government's careers ambassador, Scott Cam. Have a look.
If you did your homework and knew what you were talking about, you'd work out that all of the tours and appointments that we're going to see are school-based or education facilities like TAFEs and things like that. Now, over the summer, all of those facilities are closed. So there's no students here. I think that would be a waste of taxpayers' money if I was standing in an empty school, wouldn't you? So therefore, we're always planned to start this tour in February, and that's what we're doing today, February, March, and we're kicking it off. We're travelling around the country, and that was always the case. So all you've got to do is ask the question before you make the statements.
So you didn't negotiate that salary at all? The government just offered you $350,000 for 18 months?
My management and the government discussed the fee. That's none of your business. That's a commercial arrangement. How that came about is between my management, myself and the government.
I wouldn't say it's not any of my business, but it certainly is taxpayer business. This is taxpayer money.
Well, the amount is taxpayers' business. How that came about, that's my business, because that's what my business is. That's what I do for a living. My business is my brand, and lending that to companies and businesses to get the message out there. That's what my business is.
Scott Cam there. For someone who's been in television for a long time like him, won a gold Logie, he gave a good example there, a very good lesson on how to botch an interview.
Work by Annalise Nielsen there, Kieran. Certainly being talked about a lot, that particular interview. So I put the question, since Scott Morrison and Micaiah Cash announced that appointment last year, whether it was a captain's call by Scott Morrison to have the host of the block employed by the government in such a role. I'm told not. I'm told it was a departmental recommendation. I bet the government's keen to make that clear at the moment.
Yeah, well, defensive and quite frankly rude in that interview, so maybe the ambassador needs to relook at the interview approach. Thanks, Andrew.